Vault Entry 3, The King Who Dreamed of Crows. You have opened Drave's archives. This entry begins with the king who did not dream. Not once, not in youth, not in war, not in victory, not in grief. Sleep gave him no prophecy, no memory, no visitation from God, ghost, or guilty conscience. Only blackness until the end. There was once a king whose sleep had never betrayed him. That was considered a blessing, albeit a rare one. In his kingdom, dreams were not private things. They were studied, cataloged, interpreted, feared. Courts employed seers the way other nations employed generals. A ruler's sleep was not regarded as rest, but as another chamber of governance. A dream could mean famine or plague, or a rebellion already growing teeth in some province still polite enough to smile in broad daylight. But this king had none. No omens, no symbolic beasts, no dead queens arriving in moonlight to accuse him with perfect memory. He would close his eyes, enter dark, and rise again with nothing. For years, that emptiness was mistaken for strength. Priests called it clarity of soul. His advisors called it proof of unusual discipline. His enemies, when forced to speak well of him, called it composure. But the truth was likely simpler. He was a man the unseen had not yet bothered to address. Although that changed in the twilight years of his reign. By then, the kingdom had already begun its long turn inward. Not collapse. Not yet. Something slower. The kind of age when banners remain flying, but do so from memory more than command. When a throne still receives petitioners, through half the petitions concern losses already too old to mend properly. The king himself had grown thin in the way old rulers grow thin. Not frail, refined by burden. He had outlived wars, sons, alliances, prophets, and two separate versions of the future his court had once sworn were inevitable. And then, for the first time in all his life, he dreamed. It was not a complicated dream. That mattered, because complicated dreams, they can be argued against. And with. This dream allowed no such comfort. He just stood in his own throne room, the same long rafters, the same cracked stone, the same banners even, hanging high enough that age had reduced their colors to arguments with dust. The same throne set on its shallow rise, like a verdict that no one had fully repealed. And above him, he saw crows. Not a few, but 1,000 of them, perched along the rafters in orderly black attention, silent, watching, and waiting. That was what ruined the dream. Not noise, but silence. Because crows should have called. They should have shifted, pecked at old wood, and these did none of that. They just watched him with the stillness of things that had not come to feed. They hadn't come to feed, but they've just come to witness. The king woke before dawn. His chamber was cold enough to feel recently vacated by something that had no right to have been there. At the side of his bed, on the stone floor, lay a dead crow. One bird. The neck was bent wrong, the feathers damp with a darkness that did not yet look like blood, until the lamp was raised. He summoned no one immediately, because the first counter with the impossible rarely inspires clean alarm. More often, it inspires delay. He looked at the bird, at the shuttered windows, and at the locked door. Then he said nothing. By sunrise, the body had been removed. No servant confessed to seeing it, and no guards reported entry, and no court priest found immediate language sufficient to make the event feel holy instead of intimate. That night, though, the king slept again and dreamed again. The second dream was the same. Throne room, rafters, crows, and silence. The only difference was the number. There were more. Now that is how dread gains authority. Not through invention, but through escalation. When he woke, another crow lay dead upon the stone. Then again, the next night, and the next, and the next. He dreamt. He woke. A bird remained. Within days, the servants noticed the smell. But not the cause, and not the bodies, but the smell. The smell of rot. Feather dust. The faint, sweet wrongness of death arriving repeatedly in a room never built to admit wild things at all. No one spoke plainly at first. A chamberlain suggested fresh rushes, a physician recommended restorative tinctures, two seers requested permission to sleep inside the royal wing. The king, however, denied them all. Now that was the beginning of his solitude, not because he was proud, but because some experiences shrink the moment they are shared. They then become story too early, and story gives birth to fear, and handles it as not yet earned. So he kept the secret as long as he could. But secrets built from repetition develop odor. By the 12th night, the dream had deepened. The crows no longer sat as one body of dark witness. They had begun to vary. Some were missing eyes, some held silver rings in their beaks. One, the fragments say, wore the very crown the king had lost in war decades earlier. Now that detail broke something in him, because dreams had begun drawing not from symbol, but from memory. And on the 12th night, he refused to sleep. He locked the windows, banished the seers, burned the bedsheets. However, still, when his eyes closed, the crows returned. The bodies had started to accumulate. Each morning, another dead crow, then another, then several. Soon the king was hiding them, as one hides letters too shameful to burn and too dangerous to leave where others might ask who had written them. He ordered braziers lit at odd hours, requested burial cloth without explanation, dismissed his chamber staff more frequently, and kept his own keys as if control of hinges might still count as sovereignty. No one else could see the birds, yet the stench was undeniable. That is how the impossible finally cornered him. The king alone stood between evidence and recognition. He began speaking less, eating less. He began holding audiences only in open halls where daylight and witnesses might keep reality obedient for a few hours. But even then, the signs continued. A feather at the hem of his robes, a dark smear of the stair rail that vanished when servants were summoned. A dry clicking sound from the rafters of lesser chambers that ceased the moment he looked up. The court called it illness. Priests called it the pressure of age and crown. None, however, were correct, but each, in a limited way, was close enough to insult him. Because whatever these crows were, they'd become to behave less like omens and more along the lines of accounting. By the 30th night, the king no longer feared the crows alone. He feared what came after their counting had finished. On the 30th night, the crows were gone. That was the first horror. Absence after repetition is often worse than continuation. The king slept not from trust, but collapse. And when sleep came, it did not bring the rafters or the throne or the 1,000 watching birds. It brought a door. Tall, iron, sealed with roots. The roots, however, were not decorative. They bound the door the way scar tissue binds a wound that is closed without healing. And behind it, whispers, not words, knowing, like secrets crawling through the bone. The king approached, and as he reached for the handle, he found out his hands. They were young again, strong even, crowned again. That detail unfastens everything. For one impossible second, the dream offered him not dread, but recovery. That is how the most dangerous doors earn their grip, not by threat, but by restoration. He moved to touch the iron, and then the crows screamed. Not one, but all of them screamed. The sound broke the dream. He woke with the scream still inside him, and there at the end of his bed stood the door. The door was not a vision. It wasn't the residue of his dream. The door stood there, breathing, not opening, just waiting. The crows were gone, every last one. Not one feather remained. Only the door remained. At the end of the bed, tall as judgment, iron dark enough to drink the little light the chamber still possessed. Roots wound through it in the same pattern the dream had shown. The king called no guards, no priests, no son, cousin, or rival hungry enough to benefit from witnessing his final fracture. Whatever had come for him was not public. Others might smell rot, hear wings in the halls, dream secondhand crows years later beneath the chamber, but the door itself belonged to him. He rose. I suspect he said nothing. The truly final moments rarely benefit from speech. He crossed the chamber. The door remained closed. Breathing. When morning came, the king was gone. No body, no blood, no crown, no sign of forced exit. Only a chamber that smelled briefly and faintly of wet feathers and turned earth. And in the stone at the end of the bed, one long dark mark, as though something with roots had rested there for far longer than a single night. After the king vanished, the throne remained cold for 7 winters. That phrase has been repeated so often it risks sounding ceremonial. It was not. The kingdom simply did not know how to continue. There were heirs, of course, but something in the palace had changed. Not visibly enough for proclamation, enough for dread. Those who slept in the royal ring lasted 1 night, at most 2. None would remain through the 3rd. Some woke screaming, some woke weeping. One prince went in laughing at old superstition and emerged before dawn, white-faced and silent. Carrying in one closed fist a black feather he refused to open for anyone. The seers returned to favor then, but the seers offered no comfort. Some dreamed the rafters, some heard wings without seeing birds. One old woman, blind from childhood, stood in the abandoned throne room and said there was a door where no one else could yet see one. The people below did what people always do when power goes missing but habit remains. They continued. Bread was baked, taxes were collected badly, petitions were filed to rooms no longer confident enough to answer them. The kingdoms did not collapse because kingdoms rarely grant the suffering such elegance. No, it endured, albeit poorly, hauntedly, with the awkward balance of a body still walking after some central structure was gone from it, without announcing how much depended upon its remaining. And in the halls, the wind carried wings. As the years went on, many explanations have been proposed. Some say the crows were guilt. Others say the crows are prophecy. All those are plausible, but they were all too neat. I have never trusted neat explanations for phenomena that involve doors. Birds may symbolize, dreams may indict, but doors do something else. They divide states. Sleep from waking, youth from age, loss from retrieval, known self from the one waiting behind secrecy, and root and iron. The crows, I think, were not punishment. They were delay. A black arithmetic meant to keep the king looking upward long enough that he would understand what kind of threshold was being prepared for him. Because when the door came, it came only after the crows had finished. That is no accident. 30 nights of watching, 30 mornings of material proof, 30 chances for the king to recognize that the world had begun speaking to him in a language he had never needed before. After the 7th winter came and passed, they sealed the chamber, or they said they did. Royal masons, iron locks, stone prayers carved into lintels by hands more devout than skillful. There are even accounts of roots burned back from within the walls, though I suspect that detail was added later to reassure future readers that somebody, at some point, behaved as though containment were still a meaningful ambition. But doors of that kind do not respect stonework, at least not fully. The chamber remains in older maps of the palace, but then disappears in later copies, but then returns in drafts where some exhausted scribe forgot for one honest instant which absences the crown had ordered to become official. That is how you know the thing persisted, not by sight, but by administrative unease. And sleepers now and then still dreamed of crows. Though not always 1,000, sometimes 3, sometimes 1, and sometimes even only the sound of wings overhead, and the certainty upon waking that a door exists somewhere inside the palace more truly than any wall built to deny it. No king since has ruled there easily. That is perhaps the most practical haunting I can imagine. Only misfit. The throne no longer agrees with the body seated in it, and somewhere above in a chamber, the maps cannot decide whether to admit the old The old waiting continues with its roots and iron patience. Some stories end with warning. However, this one ends with recognition. The king who never dreamed did not begin dreaming because age weakened him. He dreamed because something had finished waiting for the rest of his life to become irrelevant. That is colder and, I think, truer. Perhaps every ruler builds such a door without knowing. Though through losses unspoken, through crowns worn too long, through compromise repeated until the self beneath them begins longing, not for forgiveness, but for return. Not to innocence, that is a child's wish, to exactness. If so, then the crows were not only witnesses, they were the cost of approach. A black flock counting down the distance between the man the world could still see and the older claim waiting behind iron for him to place his hand upon it. I do not know whether the king died. I do not know whether he entered the door, whether he fled it, whether being taken and stepped willingly became, at the final moment, too similar to distinguish honestly. But I do know this. That throne remained cold. That chamber remained dangerous, and that warning remained useful. If you dream the crows, do not open the door. Not because the door is evil. That would be simpler. Do not open it because some thresholds are built not to destroy you, but to fit you more precisely than you can survive being fit. That is worse. That is what the king learned too late after a lifetime without visions had taught him to mistake silence for safety. Some dreams pass in sleep. Others wake when you do. And somewhere in the old palace where wind still moves through broken stone like wings remembering what halls were made for, a door awaits at the end of a bed that no longer exists for a king whose name has become easier to bury than the thing that finally called him to dream. The vault closes for now. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed this archive entry of the king who did not dream until the end of his lifetime. I really like this one. It's probably a favorite one of the early scripts that I have in my computer. It's kind of a weird one, but all these are gonna be kind of weird. I'm gonna be so for real. But anyways, thank you for watching. Appreciate you. I guess that's all for now, and we'll be back with another one soon. Like, comment, subscribe if you like this one so you get notified of new uploads, and push the notification bell as well. Alright, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye bye.